Hello again. Welcome back to Secret Histories. I am your host, Brian Keene. In this series, we informally sit on the floor in my office and we talk about my books in the order that they were written and published. And with today's video, we are entering what I think of as phase 3 of my career. Phase 1 was when I was starting out as a writer, just getting published. It comprises books like No Rest for the Wicked and No Rest at All and 4x4. Phase 2 begins with The Rising and its bestseller status and the height of my popularity as a writer that occurred over the next 8 or 9 years. 8 or 9 years, not 89 years. Going from The Rising up to A Gathering of Crows, and comprising all of those works. That was also my most prolific period as a writer. Although I got to tell you, here in August of 2025, I'm starting to hit that prolific level again, and it feels good, particularly at my age, because I was a lot younger back then. Phase 3 starts with this book right here, The Rising Deliverance. However, before we talk about The Rising Deliverance, we need to talk about what my readers like to call my missing year. So, Delirium Books goes down, all the other small presses go down, Leisure Books goes down, and the mid-list goes down. And for an entire year, I've got nothing published, nothing going on. Fans are wondering where I went. Well, during that time, I was mostly involved in leading the boycott against Leisure Books, fighting to get my rights back, etc. I was also in the middle of getting divorced. I was writing 2 things when all of this occurred. One of them was this novel right here, The Damned Highway. It's a collaboration with Nick Mamatas. This is one of my personal favorites of my work. However, although we were working on this in 2009, it would not see publication until 2011, so we can't talk about that yet. The other thing I was working on was Entombed. This was supposed to be my next Leisure book. It would have followed A Gathering of Crows. I wrote the first chapter during that Clickers 3 tour, or right before that Clickers 3 tour. When I came back home, as we've talked about in the previous couple of videos, everything blew up, everything fell apart, and I did not return to this novel for some time, at least not consciously. Now I'm going to get into this more in the Entombed video. But folks, you know how the internet loves to make jokes about Stephen King doesn't remember writing the Tommyknockers, because of his addictions and substance abuse problems. You never hear me make that joke. Not only because Stephen King is a fellow fucking human being, and he's a father and he's a grandfather, and I find making jokes like that in bad taste. But the other reason I will never make those jokes is because I went through something similar with Entombed. I don't remember writing the first draft of this book, other than the first chapter. And it would be some time before I could work it into any sort of shape that could be published. So we will come back to this. What you need to know right now for this video is that I was working on things, but it was a year before anything came out, and that's because I just couldn't write. We eventually won against Leisure Books, but those were, those were days where literally all day was spent talking to the media and doing interviews and making our case and, protesting and boycotting. And it was a full-time thing. When we won, I had a heart attack. I remember that day very clearly. I was at my ex-wife's house. By that point, the divorce had been finalized. But as you know from previous installments in this series, my second ex-wife remains one of my best friends. We are still very, very close. So there wasn't any antagonism or animosity. I was sitting at her home, and I was sitting in the recliner reading our then toddler son a story, and had a heart attack. Found out later that it was most likely triggered by the stress of no longer having a publisher, of watching my finances go down to nothing. At this point, I was literally fucking broke. All that money from all those books, from The Rising up through A Gathering of Crows, was gone. I couldn't write. It was a bad time. I had done Leader of the Band, The Best of Hail Satan, Volume 4, with Thunderstorm Books, who was run by Paul Goblish, a relatively new limited edition publisher. And what was interesting about that was Paul started up right as the United States small press was crashing. And yet he was able to make a go of it. In the aftermath of that, when it was only the really big boys like Cemetery Dance and Subterranean Press and PS Publishing and Centipede and places like that left, Paul was able to make a go of it, and he was very successful. So I knew that I wanted to work more with Paul. I liked what he was doing. So we started this series called Maelstrom. The idea was once a year we'd release 3 books as a set. 2 of them would be by me. 1 of them would be by a new author who I wanted to introduce people to. So for the year, I'll show you right here, 2010, we released the first Maelstrom set. It comprised A Gathering of Crows, which was great because, again, I wasn't writing anything of note. I had worked on Entombed, but I didn't remember it. Damned Highway, I'd gotten most of my parts done before everything blew up, so it was just Nick doing the heavy lifting at that point. I was having trouble writing, so Gathering of Crows was easy peasy to do. It hadn't had a limited edition release. It only had that Leisure Books version, and that Leisure Books version went out of print almost as soon as it hit the bookstore shelves. But I still had to write something else for the second book. So I wrote The Rising Deliverance, which serves as a prequel to the Rising series. It focuses on the character of Reverend Martin. It takes place before we meet Martin in The Rising. It takes place before him and Jim encounter each other. And this was the first thing I had written in a year. It was slow going, but by the end of finishing this novella, I remembered the joy of writing, and I was able to write again. If it sounds like I'm pausing and struggling for words, it's because I don't have them. And you can imagine how frustrating that is for a writer to not have the words to describe something. What I may do here is just read the afterword that I wrote for this hardcover edition to you. And that'll help you understand where my brain was. For a guy who keeps swearing that he's done with zombies, I sure do seem to still be writing about them a lot. In case you've been living under a rock or in a coma for the last decade, most critics and media watchers agree that the current uber zombie craze in pop culture, books, movies, comics, television, games, trading cards, clothing, food, philosophy, college courses, etc., is at least partially my fault. Almost a decade ago, the publication of my first novel, The Rising, coincided with the release of a movie called 28 Days Later. Both The Rising and 28 Days Later featured different kinds of zombies, which was okay with most people since nobody else had done much with zombies for the decade leading up to the book and the movie's releases. Both were big hits. City of the Dead, my sequel to The Rising, followed soon after, and so did a lot of other books and movies and comics. And they haven't gone away. Indeed, there seem to be more of them than ever. There are now publishing companies that publish nothing but zombie literature and authors who write about nothing but the living dead. I had a chance to do the same. In truth, I could have probably made a very good living, i.e. a lot more money than what I make now, doing for zombies what Anne Rice and my friend Laurel K. Hamilton did for vampires. And I could have just written zombie novels. But doing that didn't appeal to me. I didn't want to be typecast. I didn't want to become the zombie guy. I wanted to write about other monsters and other situations. So I did. And a lot of other people came along and wrote about zombies instead, and they made a lot of money doing so. While I wrote about things like ghouls and unkillable Russian mobsters and giant carnivorous earthworms. In hindsight, those other authors might have been a lot smarter than me. I go on in this afterword to talk about, I would occasionally return to zombies with The Rising, selected scenes from the end of the world, Dead Sea, and then, of course, The Last Zombie, my comic book series. How after writing those, I swore that I was done with zombies. And then I'm going to continue with the afterword. What I'm not done with, however, is characters. The Reverend Thomas Martin has always been a personal favorite character of mine. I'm quite fond of Martin, and nobody was more surprised than I was when he died in the first few chapters of City of the Dead. I did not see that coming. I've written a lot of novels since then, but occasionally I find my thoughts returning to Martin. I knew his story wasn't over yet, even though he was dead. I knew there was a lot more to him than what readers saw in The Rising and City of the Dead. I knew that some of the more interesting parts of his saga took place before the events in those books. And I'm glad now to have finally gotten the chance to write about them. This isn't a story about zombies. It's a story about people and fate and faith and doubt and all the other things that define us and make us human. It's a story of the things that shaped Reverend Martin before readers met him in The Rising. It's about the real reason he agreed to go with Jim in search of Danny. You might have enjoyed it, you might not have, but I can tell you that I enjoyed writing it. And here's the important part, folks. Here's why I'm reading this afterword for Secret Histories. As I type this, it is mid-September 2010, and I have barely survived the year from hell. In the last 11 months, I've gone through a second divorce, the slow death of a family member, a cancer scare, a hospitalization for bronchitis, a complete and total nervous breakdown, a heart attack, absolute financial destitution at the hands of several nearly bankrupt publishers, the wholesale collapse of the horror genre, and a host of other personal crises. On top of that, I've watched those closest to me suffer through their own personal tragedies as well, many of which dwarf my own, and all of which I am powerless to prevent. As my faithful, sometime bodyguard, assistant, and driver, Big Joe, so astutely put it to me last week, what did we do to piss God off this time? Truth, folks. In the last year, I've been tempted more than ever to pack it all in, to quit writing and fuck off somewhere. Alaska, or maybe Guam. Reinvent myself under an assumed name in some remote location where nobody knows me and get a job tending bar or fishing or logging trees. There have been some days over the last year when the going got especially tough, when that urge to quit was overwhelmingly strong, and you will never know how close I came to acting on it. But instead of running away, I fled to the place where it all began for me, the world of the rising, and returned to a character that has always been near in my head and near in my heart, the Reverend Thomas Martin. Writing about him restored my faith in what I do and gave me hope that it's worthwhile. Seeing him again, if only for this brief novella, gave me my own form of deliverance. And I needed that. I hope it did something as well for you. Brian Keene, September 2010. That is why I wrote The Rising Deliverance. It was the first thing I was able to complete after that year from hell that I just detailed. This book saved my life, folks. There's no sugarcoating it. This book saved my life. I was going down a very different road. And as I said, we'll talk more about that in Entombed. But this right here is what got me started writing again. The Thunderstorm Books Maelstrom edition. Here's the signature sheet. 260 copies. Russell Dickerson did all the art. You may remember him from Scratch. A couple years later, Deadite Press brought out the trade paperback and the ebook. Very different artwork. Honestly, I can't remember who did this art. I want to say Alan Clark, maybe. Yeah, Alan Clark. Those are the only two editions. There is a Spanish edition that's combined with the Rising selected scenes from the end of the world. But you've seen that already when we covered that book. To date, there are no other foreign editions. So, anyway, yeah, this is an important one to me personally. It didn't light the genre on fire. I mean, it's sold well. You know, it's part of the Rising series. It's always going to sell well. But it lit me on fire in a good way. It was good to finally be able to break through that haze of alcohol and drugs and depression and malaise, just overall malaise, and go back to work. The first thing I had to do was unfucking tombed, and we will talk about that in our next video. Thanks for watching. We are now in phase 3. Peace.